Are you overwhelmed at the thought of starting a garden this year? Because so was I. But for the last 6 weeks or so, I've been obsessively researching and planning. I've done a lot of prep work, as you can see. So, since it's so chilly here in Central Texas, let's go inside to talk about the rest, and I'll tell you everything you need to know about starting your garden this year, too. I'm Holly. Welcome to Holly Grows. And if this is your first year gardening, that's okay because it's mine too. And I've been doing tons of planning and research for the both of us. So if you're interested in learning and growing with me, please like and subscribe and comment below what zone you're in and what you've been doing to prepare for your 2025 garden. Let's get right into the planning. I have a lot of notes written out on my iPad, so if you see me glancing down, it's because I don't want to miss anything for you guys, and I want you guys to be able to watch one video no matter what zone you're in and work on figuring out the basics of what you're doing in your garden this year, like I've done. First, you need to figure out what zone you're in. You can just Google, what gardening zone am I in? Or if you want a quick access to something, you can check the links in my bio because I'll be attaching every reference, every resource that I've used down below. You're going to go to the USDA Plant Hardiness Zone Map. And in that, it's going to ask for your zip code. When you enter that and tell it that you're not a robot, it'll tell you what zone you're in. You can take that information, for example, me in Central Texas, I'm in zone 8A. With that information, that is going to tell you what plants you can grow when and what you cannot grow. Or it's recommended that you don't grow. With this information, you need to go figure out when your last frost date is, which should be coming up pretty soon, and then your first frost date, which is going to be late fall or early winter. You can figure out what your frost dates are. For example, if you're in Texas, you can go to any county's Texas AgriLife Extension office or their website. You can put in your zip code or your county name, and it'll tell you the timeline. So for example, I'm going to give you my timeline. You can go to your local AgriLife Extension office and they'll give you the same information for your specific area. My growing season is going to be the last frost. You're going to start with your last frost date. For example, in zone 8A, it ranges sometime between March 13th and March 28th. The first frost date of the year ranges somewhere between November 7th and 28th. So you can pick anywhere in those ranges to decide what your growing season looks like. The safest way to do it would be to go to the last estimated first frost date and the first estimated last frost date. That gives you your best bet of not freezing any of your plants. So in zone 8A, that would be March 28th through November 28th. The dates for my growing season that I'm going to go with, because I want to take a little bit of risk, and I've been paying attention to the weather where I am, and I don't think that it's going to stay as cold as long as I think they think that it is. So my growing season dates that I'm going with are March 13th through November 28th. And we'll just have to see. Things change. Pay attention to the weather. But these are some good guidelines to go off of. Because once you have your last frost date of the year, you can move into our next step, which is planning your garden. What area are you going to dedicate to it? One of the first steps in planning your garden is going to be figuring out where on your property you want to place that. I have an open area next to my house, kind of behind me over here. It has a good amount of sun shading, but it does have some open areas. So I think that's one thing I'm going to fight this year is the shade. We'll just have to see, and we can always change things later. First, whatever area you think you want to dedicate, you need to pay attention to how the sun hits that area throughout the day. So yesterday, I paid attention to the area that I chose just about every hour while the sun was up and paid attention to how shaded it was. As the seasons change, your shading is going to change, but it's a good idea to have an idea of what the sun's doing around you. I decided to pick a 20 by 20 square foot area, and the next thing I had to figure out is, where am I located? Where's the north part of my property? And then obviously you can figure out the rest. The reason we need to know this is because the sun moves from the east to the west every day. That is how you decide, that's how the shading comes down on you, and that's how much sun your plants are going to get throughout the day. The north of my property is this direction, east, south, west. You need to know this because it helps you in how you're placing your planters and where you're placing the plants within that. Because you're going to want to put your plants that are the tallest towards the north side of your garden so that they're not casting shade on the smaller plants in front of them. Once you've figured out your sun exposure, then you can start deciding on what beds you want and what sizes you want. Now, when you make this decision, it feels like a big one because there's so many choices out there. I'm going to briefly go over some things you need to consider when you're making these decisions for yourself. And if you'd like more information on specifically choosing what kind of beds you want, let me know below and I'd be more than happy to make that because, again, I've done tons of research. Your first thing when considering your beds, I think, should be looking at your soil. If you feel like you have good soil, you may not have to do beds at all. You may be able to directly sow into the soil that you have. Yes, you may have to amend it some, but you can always take your soil and have it tested at your local AgriLife Extension Center, and then they'll definitely tell you what you need or what you don't need for your soil. If you don't want to grow in your soil, maybe that's because you want more control of the environment that your plants are growing in, or maybe you want your beds to be more easily accessible to you. That's up to you and that's up to your preferences. But when you're making this decision, one thing to consider while we're on the soil factor of it is if you do raised beds, it's likely going to cost you more than if you planted directly into the ground. I am not buying bagged soil. I need multiple yards of it, so I'm going to have a landscape company deliver that to me. It saves me time and it will be cheaper than buying bagged soil. Another factor you need to consider is what your budget is. There's many options for raised beds. You can build them on your own, you can have them built by somebody, or you can do something like what I did, and I actually found some on Facebook Marketplace. I'll show them to you guys later, or maybe in another video, but I got 5 3-foot by 1-foot beds. 2 of them were only 6 inches deep, so I'll probably use those for herbs, and then 3 of them were actually a foot deep. I paid $5 for all 5, so like $1 a piece. And that wasn't in my original plan, but because it was so cost effective, I pivoted my plan around being able to use those beds so that I didn't have to buy other beds, because again, this is my first garden also. The other beds that I purchased were 2 10-foot by 3-foot by 1-foot deep beds that I am going to place around the edges of my bed. I also had 2 other plastic raised beds with domes on them. I think I got them at Ollie's last year for maybe around 15 or 20 bucks a piece, and I'm also going to be using those for strawberries. Your other options aside from perhaps wooden or plastic beds is you can do grow bags. I have 2 different types of grow bags this year. I have a 2 by 4 foot bed that is gridded off in 1 by 1 foot sections, so that'll give me 8 square foot of gardening area. And then I have 10 15-gallon grow bags. Those are, I believe, about 15 inches around. So those I'm going to grow possibly squash or watermelon. I'm growing potatoes in them. You could even grow tomatoes in them. But grow bags are a really good cost-effective option, and it gives you the option to move them, which is another benefit to raised beds. All of my 2 by 3 foot beds are raised, I think, 30 inches off the ground. So if the way that I have my garden set up and it's too shaded as the growing season goes on, my boyfriend and I can just go grab those and move them to anywhere that we need to, or maybe on the other side of some other beds to accommodate them better. A few more factors that you need to consider is obviously the space that you have for these beds and the dimensions of the space that you have. If you only have a 10 by 15 foot bed, maybe having 6 4 by 4 foot beds is going to be a little too tight. So that's another thing to consider. The final thing I think you should consider is how your water is going to access the area that you chose and your beds. I actually had an original design that I have on here I could show you. I'll probably throw it on the screen. But when we got out there and we started putting our beds together and looking at how everything was fitting and our walkways and our trellises, I realized the way that I set it up made it to where I need several more feet of water hose just to make it in my garden area. So we reset, and I believe we just flipped it, kind of mirrored it. Now the water hose comes in beautifully, and I'm glad that I asked someone else's opinion because I hadn't even considered that yet. So once you have your plan set up, if you wanted to message me and ask me what I thought of it, I would love to help you, or show some people around you, join some Facebook groups for gardeners in your area, and they're usually pretty happy to help you and offer advice. Once you have picked your beds and your sizes and where you're going to place them in your garden area, next you need to choose your layout. There's a really good book about the square foot gardening method, and I'll put a link to it in my bio, and it explains more. But you can Google or even Pinterest the square foot gardening method, and you can find different diagrams that are showing how many, say, radishes you can fit in a square foot compared to maybe a brassica. So I can put 9 garlic cloves in 1 square foot. If I wasn't following this method and I was placing them sporadically, I may not necessarily have as high of a yield as I would if I stuck to this method. So we're going to see how that works this year, and maybe next year we'll change and find a different method to use. Now that we've decided where our garden's going to be and roughly where we're going to place things, now don't stick with this idea because our next step may change our plans. Our next step is picking what plants we want, and that's really the funnest part of all of it. As you're picking your plants, there's several things that you want to consider. One of them is, what are you going to eat? What do you buy most at the grocery store? What's your favorite vegetable? Pick those things. Another thing to consider are things that you struggle to find at the grocery store but you would like to have. So that may be things that are always dirty, gross produce. Maybe every time you go to grab Brussels sprouts, they're crinkly and they're gross, they're old. Maybe you should grow your own Brussels sprouts, especially if it's in your hardiness zone. I love Brussels sprouts, that's why I've used it as an example, and I plan to plant a lot of it this early spring. The last thing you need to consider is what are varieties of things. The last thing you need to consider is what variety of things do you not have access to. For example, every time you go to the grocery store, you can probably find just basic cherry tomatoes, Roma tomatoes, maybe some beef steaks, but you don't find the cool stuff, the Cherokee purples, the pear tomatoes. Try growing those things so that you can still grab your favorites at the store, but you focus your garden space on the fun stuff. And that's what makes it more rewarding to have a successful garden. As you're making this decision, you're going to realize that some plants you may not be able to buy. And that's one thing you have to think about. If it's your first year gardening and you're already overwhelmed, maybe you don't want to start your seeds. And it's okay to go to a nursery and just buy some pre-started plants. Test it out, see how you like it. Or if you know that you want to try new stuff, consider starting your seeds. I'm going to do a mix of both of those things. This next week, I'm actually going to be posting a video going over how I started my seed starting setup, what I'm doing, what I'm starting, what I'm growing. So tune in next week if you want to see that. But you may start some seeds like I'm going to, and then later in the spring when it's time to put stuff in the ground, probably go peruse some nurseries and decide if there's something there that you didn't grow that you'd like to have in the ground. When you're considering what plants you want to grow, consider what pests there are, what companions you can grow as you're picking these plants, for example, marigolds or nasturtium or borage. You're also going to want to maybe consider planting something to attract in pollinators, so maybe that's some wildflowers. And that's great as long as you're making sure that they're native to your area. These are most of the things that I initially considered when I was planning my 2025 garden, so I'm going to leave you with these to think on this week. Next week, we're going to dig into starting our seeds. We're going to go over what we should start when and all of the stuff that goes into that. So you don't have to research. I've got that covered for you. Come back next week and see how we're starting our seeds. Please comment below if you enjoyed the video, subscribe, and give me a like. I really appreciate it. Thanks, guys.